You have probably heard this about Russian literature at one point or the other. Oh, it is so depressing, everybody's suffering, nobody's happy, nor the characters, nor the author, nor the readers, no one. And yes, that is true for the most of the big Russian novels and Russian classics in general, but I've decided to compile a list of Russian classics that do actually have a happy ending. Let's go through it. Piece of warning before we get started, a happy ending is a little bit in the eye of the beholder. I will try to justify why I added this or that piece onto the list, but you might still disagree with me. However, keep in mind that it is still Russian lit, so we need to set the bar for happy rather low by most standards, and that's just something that we would have to be content with. And obviously a huge spoiler warning, but I do believe that you can read classics even knowing the ending, so let's proceed. If we're looking for happier books, we need to start with the Romanticism period in Russian literature, early 19th century. They were not as jaded then, and they were also experimenting with genres and topics and subject matters, so there are quite a few books for us to choose from. Let's start with Alexander Pushkin, the most obvious place to start. He's most famous for his poetry, and with good reason, but poetry is notoriously difficult to translate, so I will not point you there. However, I will point you to his prose, specifically Captain's Daughter and Belkin's Tales. All of Pushkin's prose is short prose, and it is a little bit whimsical, a little bit naive. You will especially feel it in The Captain's Daughter, where the entire conflict is resolved via a wonderful deus ex machina in the form of the Queen. But that lends itself nicely to a happy resolution to those stories. Are they all realistic? Hell no, but they're cute, and for early prose, they're quite nice. Out of the Belkin Tales, a collection of short stories, only Station Master has a rather tragic end. All of the rest are safe. My personal favorite is The Blizzard, sometimes translated as The Snowstorm, and it is a true representation of Romanticism period and romantic prose in general. And the plot, it comes straight out of like a fanfic or romantic novel, and I love it for it. Another title from Pushkin that does have a happy ending is Ruslan and Lyudmila, a poem where Pushkin weaved in elements of Russian heroic epos, and it is kind of fun. It also has eroticism elements, well, 19th century eroticism, so not really, but yeah. The next book on the list is slightly controversial. It is a comedy, War from Wit, and it is a comedy, so by the very definition, it does have a happy ending, or should have a happy ending. I just feel like the protagonist, Chatsky, would disagree on that one, since he didn't get what he wanted in the form of a bride. But I would argue that he got what he needed, and that is to get away from that Moscow society. So in principle, it's much more of a neutral ending if we spend a little bit more time just thinking about it. Similar problem with the Nikolai Gogol's book that I want to add to this list. Gogol has a few short stories that do have happy endings, especially his Evenings on the Farm near Dikainka collection. Those stories have a certain fairy tale quality to them, so they naturally gravitate towards happy endings, even if they are not going to be on the nose or they have some ambiguity to them as to what actually happened and what's going to happen next. But I really want to propose Dead Souls for this list, and I'm only tentative because that book has a slightly open ending. We know that Gogol intended for Dead Souls to have another 2 volumes, so the novel ends with Chichikov riding off into the sunset, leaving the door open for more adventures for him, and hopefully some personal growth as well. But if we take this novel in isolation, Chichikov gets away with his machination. If you remember, he was buying off dead souls, the dead peasants who have not yet been reported as such to the authorities, and thus building fortune that way. And yes, he gets found out in the town X and he has to flee from it, but I think he even has his papers with him, so he gets off scot-free. Maybe we would have wanted a different ending for him to see the error of his ways, but this is what we have. And honestly, no one dies, no one goes mad, nobody gets left at the altar, and if you've read any Russian novel, you know how rare it is. So we will add this book to the list and move on to realism. And Russian realism is actually where most of the problem lies, since these bearded men understood realism as something rather dark, like dragging the vices of humanity to the surface and shining light on them and preaching against them, which from morality standpoint is not a bad thing to have in your novel, but the end result is this long list of novels with utterly miserable characters. Look, I've read a lot of Russian classics, but obviously not all of them. So as I was compiling this list, I needed to look up endings for the books that I haven't read. And I kid you not, it almost turned into like a comedy skit. I was going down the list of big Russian novels and asking my Alexa-type device, how does this book end? And how does this one end? And every freaking time, this character dies, this one ends his own life, this one goes mad, these ones are separated, these ones are miserable. And yes, it's partly my fault since I have not read most of Dostoevsky's works, but it's not just him. It's also Turgenev, Tolstoy, Saltykov-Shchedrin, Goncharov, Chekhov, all of them. So from the Russian realism of the late 19th century, I have 2 books to offer you, and what doozies they are. First one is actually War and Peace. As any good epic, it has a buttload of characters, and so obviously not everybody's gonna make it, and even those that do, it's not gonna be smooth sailing. But for the core cast that do make it to the end, it's actually a happy ending. The first part of the epilogue is supposed to be this marriage bliss for the main 4, and yes, maybe I do disagree that it is a happy ending for the females, because oh my god, but categorically it is happy ending. There are some hints to unrest brewing in the country and some troubles ahead, but it's all in the future. The novel ends happy. Now the question only is if you're willing to read through all of these pages about these different Russian families during the time of Napoleon's march on Moscow. But really, Tolstoy is not difficult to read, it's simply long. The plot and the writing style are not hard, so don't feel intimidated. I do believe in you. Just set aside a month or 2 to read this book and you're good to go. Now, controversially, the second novel that I want to propose for this list is actually Crime and Punishment. Because I've defined the criteria for this list as happy ending and not happy story overall, it fits. Think about it, if you read the novel, the antagonists of the story get what they deserve, Luzhin and Svidrigailov both, and even Raskolnikov ends the novel kind of accepting his punishment and ready to serve time. Razumikhin marries Raskolnikov's sister, Sonia follows Raskolnikov to Siberia, where he finally sees her as his partner. And most importantly, Raskolnikov, in his exile, hard labor camp, wherever he ended up in, he finds God. And to Dostoevsky, that's most important. That is his thesis statement, that you can only find God and absolution through suffering. And that's exactly what Raskolnikov is doing. Is it a happy ending in an absolute sense? Maybe not, but for the novel as it is written, it is. And I'm not even being facetious here, I despise Dostoevsky, but the character resolution for both Sonia and Rodion is exactly what they needed. Sonia eternally saving Raskolnikov, as any good woman would. And Raskolnikov finally finding peace from this eternal, internal philosophical struggle that he was grappling with and that was tearing him apart the entirety of the novel. So yeah, they lived happily ever after. And from the big Russian novels of the 19th century, that's about it. And that's where their reputation of the most depressing literature comes from. If Crime and Punishment is on this list, we're struggling. I could have included some short stories from like Chekhov or Kuprin. They have some that fit the bill, but they are most famous for other things, like Chekhov for his plays, that are most depressing things ever. And Kuprin's most famous pieces also have tragic endings, so let's move on to the 20th century. And finally, Alexander Green understood the assignment. He was writing in the darkest times for the country and himself, and he wrote uplifting stories. Not all of them, but his most famous pieces are The Scarlet Sails and She Who Runs on Waves. They are happy. And rarer still, they are happy throughout. The characters are going through hardships, but it's never a downer, and simply life's challenges that they need to work through and go through in order for them to reach their happy endings. Both of these stories are leaning towards fairy tales, Scarlet Tales in particular. Green called it a fairy. Now it's most often labeled as a fairy tale for grown-ups, or at least a romantic novel. The story about a girl who gets told that her destined partner would arrive under the scarlet sails, and she gets mercilessly ridiculed for it until it finally happens. And it is a nice story, naive but not teeth-rotting fluff. I reread it recently for this channel and I enjoyed it quite a bit, so you might as well. Staying in the early 20th century, Mikhail Bulgakov has a few stories that do have happy endings. A Young Doctor's Notebook, in contrary to its TV adaptation, ends on an uplifting note where the doctor once again finds strength and zest to continue his practice. I have not read White Guard, so I'm getting conflicting evidence. The subject matter does not really lend itself to a particularly happy story, and the Cliff's notes are not conclusive. It feels like he leaves his characters at a good moment before all hell breaks loose, but I cannot say that for certain. If you've read it, let me know. What I really want to talk about is Master and Margarita. I've made a video on it on this channel. It was actually my very first video here, so I cannot remember if I brought it up there, but there is some discussion as to whether or not the characters do actually get a happy ending. To remind you, the devil comes to Moscow, and one of the things that he does, amongst the other shenanigans, is that at Margarita's request, he frees the master from an insane asylum where he ended up while writing a book about Pontius Pilate. The book ends with the devil taking the master and Margarita away from Moscow, and he offers them eternal peace since they can no longer reach heaven but don't deserve hell either. And this is the point of contention, if this peace is actually something that those lovers would find to be a happy ending. They are together for all eternity, yes, and that's something both of them really wanted, but there is some ambiguity and uncertainty if this peace would suit their personalities. That's something for you to think about. But I would still suggest that the book has a happy ending, since one of the storylines, the Pontius Pilate and the fake Jesus storyline, ends happily, since Pilate is finally reunited with Yeshua and joins him in heaven. So on the whole, a lot more good in that ending than bad, so yeah. Live in Russian soil for a bit. A great Russian-American author, Mr. Vladimir Nabokov, has more than Lolita to offer. And the book that needs to be on this list is his novel The Gift. A somewhat autobiographical piece where Nabokov talks about his escape from Russia, but also the writer's gift and duty. I have not read The Gift, but all of the sources are in agreement on this, that it does fit the bill for a happy ending story. I, on the other hand, have read The Invitation to a Beheading, and that one does have a happy ending for sure. It is a phantasmagorical book that feels like a bad trip, but the ending is a happy one where the protagonist breaks free from this reality that was tormenting him, so there you go. I haven't read much from Nabokov, don't like him that much, but these two fit the bill. Switching gears, another genre that we can talk about is Soviet sci-fi, Strugatsky Brothers in specific. I would argue that they're already considered classics, and they have something to offer us. I've read a few things from them. Roadside Picnic, Snail on the Slope, and Hard to Be a God do not fit the bill. They have rather tragic endings. But something like Monday Begins on Saturday or even Uninhabited Island do. Monday Begins on Saturday is a much more neutral book, depicting the lives of scientists working in a magical institute, so it doesn't have a concise plot for it to have an ending, but it still ends fine. But Uninhabited Island does have a happy ending. It is a sci-fi dystopia. The events take place on a different planet, with the protagonist coming from Earth, and the book ends with him and revolutionaries shaking up the status quo. And while the protagonist Kramer is stuck on that planet and the future is uncertain, it's not your typical dystopia ending where the system crushes the protagonist. No, he perseveres. He even manages to shake up the status quo and destroy the system that was controlling them, I think. So yeah, it fits the bill. I also thought about including something from Davlatov or Zoshenko on this list. They wrote humorous stories, but I haven't read anything from Zoshenko, so I cannot recommend anything. And Davlatov... Davlatov has a very dry sense of humor. His stories are not haha funny. They are rather level. The highs are not very high, the lows are not very low. So I cannot even say that they have happy endings, they're just fine endings, I guess. You can check them out, just be ready for the heady flavor of Soviet alcoholism. I should probably mention something from Russian contemporary. I read a lot of it this year, and I really only want to recommend one. Three Apples Fell from the Sky by Narine Abgaryan, an Armenian author writing in Russian. This book, more than any other on this list, fits the bill for the happy ending, so if you come away from this video with one book recommendation, let it be this one. I am both sure and hopeful that I've missed some great Russian classics that do have happy endings. Leave them in the comments, and if we gather enough of them, there might be a part 2. But for now, keep reading and keep smiling, I guess.